The wind howled across the frozen marshland like a banshee's wail, carrying with it the salt spray of winter storms that had battered the German coastline for weeks. Obergefreiter Klaus Reinhardt stood in the observation tower of Luftwaffe Station Borkum, his leather gloves stiff with cold, his breath forming small clouds that dissipated into the gray dawn. Below him, the airfields stretched out in orderly rows, Messerschmitt fighters lined with Prussian precision, their wings dusted with morning frost. In the distance, beyond the dunes and the concrete bunkers, the North Sea churned, dark and infinite. Reinhardt was 23 years old, a graduate of the Technical University of Berlin, trained in radio communications and electromagnetic theory. 6 months earlier, he had stood in a lecture hall listening to General Major Wolfgang Martini explain that the future of aerial warfare belonged to those who mastered the invisible spectrum. But this morning, as he watched a British reconnaissance plane disappear into the cloud cover, too high, too fast for the anti-aircraft guns, Reinhardt felt the first cold fingers of doubt creeping into his confidence. The plane had appeared from nowhere. No coastal observer had spotted it. No sound had preceded its arrival. It was as if the British could see through fog and darkness, as if they possessed eyes that transcended human limitation. He did not know it yet, but what Klaus Reinhardt witnessed that morning was the beginning of the end of German technological supremacy. Somewhere across that gray expanse of water, British radar stations were already tracking his position with a precision that would have seemed like sorcery only 5 years before. The invisible war had begun, and Germany, despite its vaunted engineering prowess, despite its faith in blitzkrieg and superior tactics, was about to learn a lesson written in fire and rubble, that dismissing your enemy's innovation is the first step toward your own destruction. In the autumn of 1935, while Adolf Hitler consolidated his grip on Germany and the world watched with nervous fascination, a Scottish physicist named Robert Watson Watt sent a memorandum to the British Air Ministry. The document was technical, dense with mathematical formulas and electromagnetic theory, but its conclusion was revolutionary. It was possible to detect aircraft at long distances by bouncing radio waves off their metal surfaces. The British called it RDF, radio direction finding. The Germans would come to know it by its American name, radar. Britain, an island nation haunted by the memory of Zeppelin raids in the Great War, and now facing the prospect of German bombers that could reach London in minutes, embraced this technology with desperate urgency. By 1938, a chain of radar stations stretched along the eastern and southern coasts of England, 20 towering steel masts that could detect incoming aircraft at ranges exceeding 100 miles. The system was called Chain Home, and it transformed the skies over Britain from an undefended void into a mapped battlefield where every aircraft became a coordinate, every formation a mathematical problem to be solved. The Germans knew about British radar. German intelligence had photographed the towers. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights had detected the transmissions. In 1939, the dirigible Graf Zeppelin, equipped with sensitive listening equipment, had flown along the British coast specifically to analyze these mysterious signals. The conclusion reached by German scientists was dismissive, almost contemptuous. The British system, they reported, was primitive, operating on long wavelengths that provided poor resolution, dependent on massive fixed installations that could be easily destroyed. German radar research, by contrast, focused on shorter wavelengths and mobile equipment, technologically superior in almost every measurable way. What the Germans failed to understand was that technological elegance meant nothing if you didn't deploy it effectively. While German engineers refined their equipment in laboratories, the British built an integrated air defense system, a network that linked radar stations to fighter command centers, to observer corps, to anti-aircraft batteries. The British didn't just detect aircraft, they created a system where information flowed seamlessly from detection to interception, where a radar operator on the coast could guide a Spitfire pilot with instructions delivered in real time over radio. The Germans had better radar technology, but the British had built something more important. They had built an infrastructure of information warfare. The autumn of 1935, while Adolf Hitler consolidated his grip on Germany and the world watched with nervous fascination, a German pilot named Hans Butt flew his Messerschmitt Bf 109 over the southern English coast, noting the towers with curious professional interest. Butt, like his opponents, understood that radar was a game-changing technology, and while Butt considered himself a priest of the cult of speed, he also understood the technical demands of electromagnetic surveillance, and he knew that Britain had an edge in the digital world. In the summer of 1940, as the Germans watched unfolding before their eyes a battlefield that few could have imagined only years before, they realized that this new element of warfare was utterly crucial in the war for supremacy. The Luftwaffe entered the Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940 believing in their own invincibility. They had crushed Poland in weeks, swept through France in 40 days, driven the British Army into the sea at Dunkirk. German pilots spoke of the coming campaign with casual confidence. A few weeks of intensive bombing, they believed, and England would sue for peace. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, promised Hitler that his air force would bring England to its knees without a single German soldier having to cross the Channel. They expected scattered resistance, outdated fighters, a demoralized enemy. What they encountered instead was a defense system that seemed omniscient. German bomber formations, carefully assembled over France, would find British fighters waiting for them at altitude before they even crossed the English coast. Attacks planned for dawn, when visibility was poor and defensive response slow, were met with full squadrons of Spitfires and Hurricanes positioned perfectly to intercept. Luftwaffe intelligence officers pored over maps, trying to understand how the British seemed to always know where and when they were coming. Some proposed elaborate spy networks. Others suggested that British pilots were simply suicidally aggressive, maintaining constant patrols that inevitably stumbled upon German formations. The truth was visible from any aircraft that flew over southern England, those tall steel towers standing along the coastline like sentinels. But the Luftwaffe High Command, having already dismissed radar as a strategic insignificant, refused to revise their assessment. Even when German pilots reported the towers, even when intelligence analysts correlated British response times with radar coverage zones, Göring and his inner circle clung to their initial conclusion. The towers, they insisted, were decoys or propaganda, designed to intimidate. Real air defense, the Germans believed, depended on pilot skill and aircraft quality. The idea that a primitive detection system could neutralize Germany's aerial superiority seemed impossible, an admission of weakness they refused to make. July 24, 1943, Hamburg, Germany. The air raid sirens began at 10 minutes past midnight, their wail rising and falling across a city that had learned to dread those sounds. In the shelters beneath Hamburg's streets, families huddled together while overhead the first Pathfinder aircraft dropped flares, brilliant magnesium stars that turned night into day, marking the target for the bomber stream that followed. Oberst Friedrich Hoffmann, commanding the Hamburg air defense sector, watched from his bunker as his radar screens filled with contacts, hundreds of aircraft, a massive formation approaching from the northwest. But something was wrong. The radar returns were multiplying impossibly, fragmenting into thousands of individual targets that swamped his tracking stations. Operators shouted contradictory information. One screen showed bombers at 10,000 feet, another placed them at 20,000. Hoffman ordered his night fighters to intercept, vectoring them toward the largest concentration of contacts. His pilots reported that they found nothing, empty air where the radar swore enemy bombers were flying. The British had deployed window, clouds of aluminum strips dropped by the thousands, each one cut to precisely half the wavelength of German radar frequencies. The result was electromagnetic chaos. German radar operators, trained to trust their equipment absolutely, now faced screens that showed ghost armies, phantom bombers that existed only as reflections of scattered radio waves. In the confusion, the real British bombers, nearly 800 Lancasters and Halifaxes, flew through the defenses almost unopposed. What followed would be known as Operation Gomorrah, and it transformed Hamburg into a vision of apocalypse. The first wave dropped high explosives that tore open buildings and created kindling from homes. The second wave dropped incendiaries, thousands of thermite bombs that ignited fires so numerous and so intense that they merged into a single firestorm. The heated air rose so violently that it created winds at ground level exceeding 100 miles per hour, winds that sucked oxygen from shelters and pulled people into the flames like leaves before a hurricane. The firestorm reached temperatures of 800 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt glass, hot enough to ignite asphalt pavement. Hoffman, in his concrete bunker equipped with the finest German radar equipment, could do nothing. His screens showed thousands of targets. His night fighters circled uselessly, burning fuel while below them Hamburg burned. By dawn, when the all-clear finally sounded, over 40,000 people were dead, more casualties than Britain had suffered during the entire Blitz. The city's industrial heart was devastated, its submarine yards damaged, its workforce traumatized. But the true casualty was German confidence in their technological defenses. The aluminum strips that accomplished this, each one a simple piece of metal, mass-produced in British factories for pennies, represented a revolution in warfare that the Luftwaffe had never anticipated. German radar, which seemed so sophisticated in laboratory tests, proved vulnerable to a countermeasure so basic that it could be manufactured by unskilled workers and deployed by simply opening a chute and letting gravity do the work. The British had defeated German radar not through superior engineering, they had defeated it through superior understanding, recognizing that even the most advanced system has fundamental physical limitations that can be exploited with simple means. In the months that followed Hamburg, German scientists scrambled to develop radar systems that could distinguish between chaff and aircraft. They created new frequencies, new signal processing techniques, new operational procedures. But they were fighting a losing battle against an enemy that had fundamentally grasped something the Germans had not, that radar was not just a technology, but an entire discipline of electronic warfare, where offense and defense evolved in endless cycles of innovation and counter-innovation. By 1944, as Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Europe, radar had evolved from a defensive tool into an offensive weapon of terrifying precision. British and American bombers carried sophisticated H-2S radar units that could map ground terrain through clouds and darkness, allowing navigation and targeting regardless of weather or visibility. Pathfinder squadrons used these systems to mark targets with an accuracy that made even heavily fortified installations vulnerable. The Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heartland, was systematically destroyed by raids guided entirely by radar, attacks that the Luftwaffe could neither predict nor effectively counter. German military bases, once considered safe if they were located away from obvious targets or if they maintained strict radio silence, found themselves exposed. Allied intelligence, using radar-equipped reconnaissance aircraft, could map German positions with photographic precision. Synthetic aperture radar systems could detect the metallic signatures of aircraft and vehicles, even when they were camouflaged or hidden in forests. The hidden became visible, the invisible became tangible, and the electromagnetic spectrum became a battle space where Germany was hopelessly outmatched. Nowhere was this more evident than in the Battle of the Atlantic, where radar transformed submarine warfare from a deadly game of cat and mouse into a systematic hunt that Germany could not win. U-boats, which had nearly strangled Britain's supply lines in 1942, found themselves hunted by aircraft equipped with centimetric radar that could detect a submarine's conning tower in total darkness from miles away. German submariners who had once felt safe on the surface at night now found that darkness offered no protection. The Bay of Biscay, through which all U-boats had to transit, became known as the Valley of Death, a stretch of water patrolled by radar-equipped aircraft that attacked without warning, emerging from the night sky like avenging angels. German engineers developed the Metox radar detector, a device that could warn submarines of incoming radar signals, but the Allies simply switched to shorter wavelengths that Metox couldn't detect. Germany created the Schnorkel, a breathing tube that allowed submarines to run their diesel engines while submerged, reducing surface exposure. But Allied radar became sensitive enough to detect even the small profile of a Schnorkel cutting through the waves. Every German countermeasure was met with an Allied adaptation, and the spiral of technological competition always tilted in favor of the side that had embraced radar not just as a gadget, but as a fundamental transformation of warfare. The psychological impact on German forces was profound and corrosive. Luftwaffe pilots who had entered the war believing in the superiority of German technology and tactics now felt like targets in a shooting gallery operated by an enemy who could see everything. Wehrmacht officers discovered that movement at night, once a reliable way to avoid air attack, simply meant being destroyed in darkness rather than daylight. German soldiers, raised on propaganda about Germany's scientific supremacy, faced the humiliating reality that the British and Americans had mastered a technology that Germany had pioneered but failed to effectively deploy. In prisoner of war camps and interrogation centers, German personnel spoke with bitter resignation about the Allied radar advantage. A Luftwaffe night fighter pilot shot down over the Ruhr in early 1944 told his interrogators that flying against British bombers equipped with tail warning radar was like fighting a man who has eyes in the back of his head. A U-boat commander, pulled from the Atlantic after his submarine was destroyed by a radar-guided attack, said simply, "We were blind men fighting those who could see." The tragedy was that German scientists had understood radar's potential from the beginning. German engineers had developed sophisticated radar systems, some technically superior to Allied equivalents. But German military leadership had failed to grasp the strategic implications, treating radar as a technical curiosity rather than a war-winning technology. That failure partly stemmed from arrogance, the assumption that German tactical superiority would overcome any defensive advantage, and partly from organizational dysfunction. The German military, divided into competing fiefdoms, where the Luftwaffe, Wehrmacht, and Kriegsmarine each pursued their own development programs, never created an integrated approach that made British and American radar systems so effective. The aluminum chaff strips became, in the final analysis, more than a tactical countermeasure. They became a symbol of asymmetric warfare, of how technological sophistication could be defeated by simple elegance and mass production. Each strip represented pennies of raw material and seconds of manufacturing time, yet deployed in sufficient quantities, they could neutralize radar systems that represented millions of marks of investment and years of research. The strips fell from British bombers like snow, like confetti celebrating the funeral of German air defense, like ticker tape commemorating the death of technological hubris. German radar operators grew to hate those aluminum strips with a personal passion that transcended military professionalism. The strips clogged their screens, confused their systems, turned precision instruments into sources of misinformation. Maintenance crews found the strips everywhere after raids, tangled in antenna arrays, wrapped around equipment, scattered across fields like discarded Christmas tinsel. Some operators kept strips in their pockets, fingering them like worry beads, physical reminders of their impotence against an enemy who could blind them with something so simple. By the time Soviet forces entered Germany from the east and Allied armies crossed the Rhine from the west, German radar capabilities had been largely neutralized. The Luftwaffe, reduced to a shadow of its former strength, could no longer mount effective defenses. German cities burned under aerial bombardment that came with mechanical regularity, guided by radar systems that made weather and darkness irrelevant. The electromagnetic spectrum, which German scientists had helped to understand and which German engineers had learned to manipulate, had been turned against them by an enemy that understood not just the technology, but its strategic application. In the ruins of Berlin, as Soviet artillery shattered what remained of Hitler's capital, German radar operators continued to man their posts in underground bunkers, watching screens that showed an overwhelming mass of contacts: Soviet aircraft, American bombers, British reconnaissance planes. The information was accurate, detailed, and completely useless. There were no fighters left to scramble, no ammunition for the anti-aircraft guns, no hope that detection alone could prevent what was coming. The radar screens glowed with pale green light, showing everything and changing nothing, monuments to a technology that Germany had understood but failed to master. May 8, 1945, Flensburg, northern Germany. The war in Europe ended not with glory, but with paperwork, with signatures applied to surrender documents in schoolhouses and command posts scattered across a devastated continent. Obergefreiter Klaus Reinhardt, the young radar operator who had watched British reconnaissance planes with puzzled concern in January 1940, was now Hauptmann Reinhardt, 5 years older and a lifetime more experienced. He had served at Hamburg during Operation Gomorrah, had watched his screens fill with impossible contacts while the city died. He had trained new operators, had seen them grow old before their time as they realized that their sophisticated equipment could be defeated by strips of aluminum. He had survived through luck and transfers, finding himself finally at Flensburg, at the headquarters of what remained of the German military command, when the end came. On that May morning, as spring sunshine broke through clouds that had seemed perpetual, Reinhardt walked out of his bunker for the last time. Behind him, the radar screens went dark as technicians followed orders to shut down all systems. The steel towers that had bristled with antennas were silent now, their receivers no longer scanning the skies for threats that no longer mattered. Reinhardt stood on the hillside above the bunker, looking out over the Baltic Sea, the same gray water that washed against Borkum Island 5 years and a lifetime ago. In his pocket, he carried a single strip of aluminum chaff, picked up from a field near Hamburg during one of the massive raids. He had kept it as a reminder, though of what exactly he was never quite sure. Perhaps it was a reminder of German hubris, of how a nation that prided itself on technical excellence had been defeated partly by its own assumptions. Perhaps it was a reminder that wars were not won by having the best weapons, but by understanding how to use them, how to integrate them into systems and strategies and operational doctrines. Or perhaps it was simply a piece of metal, light as a feather, worthless as scrap, that had helped to bring down the Third Reich. Years later, after the prisoners had been released, after the trials at Nuremberg, after Germany began its slow reconstruction, Reinhardt would write a memoir about his experiences as a radar operator. The book was technical, filled with specifications and operational details, but its conclusion was almost philosophical. We saw everything and understood nothing. We built magnificent machines and forgot that war is not about machines, but about systems, about people, about the integration of technology into strategy. We dismissed our enemy's tools as primitive because they were simpler than ours, never realizing that simplicity deployed at scale defeats complexity deployed in isolation. The memoir sold poorly. Post-war Germany was not interested in technical discussions of radar and electronic warfare. The nation wanted to forget, to rebuild, to move forward rather than analyze its defeats. But Reinhardt's conclusion echoed a truth that military historians would spend decades unpacking, that the German dismissal of Allied radar was not merely a technical mistake, but a fundamental failure of strategic imagination. In the end, radar did not win the Second World War. Courage won it, and sacrifice, and industrial capacity, and the determination of millions of people who fought against fascism in factories and fields, and on the seas and in the skies. But radar was one of the threads woven through that victory, a technological advantage that magnified courage and multiplied sacrifice and leveraged industrial capacity into effects that transcended the sum of individual actions. The Germans dismissed radar because it challenged their self-conception as the world's premier engineering nation. They could not accept that a British system they judged technically inferior could be strategically superior. They could not imagine that their enemies, whom they had dismissed as decadent democracies lacking German discipline and focus, could outthink them. That failure of imagination cost them control of the air over Britain in 1940, cost them Hamburg in 1943, cost them the Battle of the Atlantic, and ultimately contributed to their total defeat. The lesson written in those aluminum chaff strips, in the ruins of German cities, in the wreckage of U-boats and the burned-out hulks of Luftwaffe fighters, was simple but profound. Never dismiss your enemy's innovations, no matter how primitive they appear. Technology is not about elegance or sophistication. It is about effectiveness and integration. A simple tool deployed systematically beats a sophisticated weapon used thoughtlessly. An enemy who understands the strategic implications of technology will defeat an enemy who sees it merely as another gadget, another toy for engineers to refine. The radar towers along the English coast, those ugly steel structures that German intelligence had photographed and dismissed, stood as monuments to this truth. They were not beautiful. They were not technically impressive by German standards, but they were effective, integrated into a system that transformed detection into interception, information into action, technology into victory. They represented not German engineering precision, but something more powerful, democratic pragmatism, the willingness to build what worked rather than what looked impressive, to deploy imperfect systems at scale rather than waiting for perfect systems that might never come. And in the post-war world that emerged from the ashes of total conflict, that lesson resonated beyond military applications. The Cold War that followed would be defined by radar and electronic warfare, by early warning systems and intercontinental detection networks, by the understanding that the electromagnetic spectrum was a battle space as important as land, sea, or air. The Germans had been the first to lose a war partly because they dismissed radar. They would not be the last to learn that technological overconfidence is its own form of blindness, and that the enemy who sees clearly, even with primitive eyes, will triumph over self-imposed blindness, no matter how sophisticated the instruments that failed to see.